Yeah, once again, everyone is welcome to this edition of a seminar under the Institute of African Studies seminar series. Institute of African Studies is here at the University of Ghana at Legon. Today, we are very privileged to have Max Vardon. Apologies on behalf of the chair for this event, my colleague and research fellow here at the Institute of African Studies is unavoidably absent and will be joining us later on in the program. But like I said, we are lucky to have Max, who has training in science, engineering, and economics. You'll be surprised. Max has long pursued a career as a corporate midwife, helping people birth their ambitions and aspirations at numerous levels, personal, divisional, departmental, institutional, and other contexts like commerce and industry, government. He's currently promoting Ghanaian invented technology designed to bring sanity to the energy distribution space. Max is a commentator on African affairs, a consummate humanist. Is deeply concerned by the challenges facing humanity, as this presentation suggests at this time, especially by Africans and our own dear continent. And he seeks to offer new paradigms of praxis, technology, and thought leadership to help chart the way forward for a better world, essentially. So we have Max. We are very, like I said, we are very lucky to have you, and you have the virtual floor. You can go for all of 25 minutes, 30 in the first instance, after which you will take questions and comments from the audience. Thank you so much, Max.
Okay. Thank you very much, Chika. Can everybody hear me okay? Can you hear me okay, Chika?
Yeah. Yes.
Well, welcome on board. I'd like to subtitle this presentation, An African Dream, How to Transform the Nightmare. Because we live in a very dysfunctional world and continent. And what I'm hoping to do is to bring some understanding and insight into why we are where we are. And then perhaps we can look at how to move forward from where we are. So essentially, the presentation is going to be in 4 parts. One is a lengthy context discourse on what is actually going on, what is driving our world. Then there's a shorter section on convergences, what has been happening in recent times to create the crises that we face. So that gets summarized in the current challenges section. And then the last section I call counterpoints, which is where I'm offering suggestions as to how to deal with the problems that are ahead of us. So this is the context. The world is in turmoil. Concerned primarily with earning their daily bread, many assume the challenges are random and uncoordinated. Closer inspection suggests otherwise. Undergirding the apparent chaos, there seems to be deliberate acts guiding the world inexorably towards a future that some have described as dystopian. Meanwhile, the world today presents numerous challenges, many of them deliberately global in scope, dimension, and nature. For this reason, some analysts refer to the key protagonists as the globalists, which I propose to adopt for this presentation. But a little history is in order, and sometimes where to begin is even a challenge. So we'll start off the Christian church as an institution. In the 4th century AD, between AD 315 and 382, the Christian church was as an institution with a religious framework based on a triune canon, coalesced under King Constantine from various strands into the Catholic faith we know today. What few may realize that the formalization of the church as a hierarchical, social, religious structure and institution in essence, destroyed the purity of the Christ message of direct communion with God and opened it up to human folly and therefore satanic influence. The papacy. I think it's safe to say, though, that Africa's global standing in modern times begins with Pope Nicholas V's 1455 bull Romanus Pontifex, which gave Portuguese King Alfonso license, quote, invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue, unquote, people in the lands of discovery, with instructions to, again, quote, reduce their persons to perpetual slavery and to apply and appropriate to himself and his successors their kingdoms, dukedoms, countries, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and convert them to his and their use and profit, unquote. Yeah, this is coming from the Pope now. This reversal of Christian charity and values is clear evidence that already by this time, the influence of the Antichrist was beginning to manifest in European so-called Christian society. The 1493 Doctrine of Discovery, also a papal decree, aimed to justify Christian European explorers' claims on land and waterways they allegedly discovered and to promote domination and superiority, which has been applied in Africa, Asia, Australia, New Zealand, and the Americas. 1 year later, the Treaty of Tordesillas sought to harmonize Portuguese and Spanish interests in the New Worlds, but was largely ignored by other European nations. This doctrine of discovery was never repealed, and even now, today, the fight against the doctrine goes on. And here's a quote from the Assembly of First Nations National Chief Roseanne Archibald in Canada. Quote, I am asking the Holy Father to renounce and formally revoke the 1493 Doctrine of Discovery and replace it with a new papal bull that decrees indigenous peoples and cultures are valuable, worthy, and must be treated with dignity and respect. And this is something I was sent to Pope Francis in Rome in December. Now we look at Africa's untold role in European civilization. Ironically, modern civilization came to Europe via Spain from Africa's Moorish conquerors, who instituted facilities like town planning, street lights, sidewalks, public baths, universities, sewage systems, navigation technology, etc., during an 8 centuries long occupation of Spain from around 711 AD. They introduced new scientific technologies to Europe, such as the compass and the astrolabe, a device for measuring the position of the stars and planets. Scientific progress in astronomy, chemistry, physics, mathematics, geography, and philosophy flourished in Black Moorish Spain. The Moors introduced paper and Arabic numerals to replace the clumsy Roman numerals system. Education was universal in Moorish Spain, available to all, while in Christian Europe, 99% of the population were illiterate, and even kings could neither read nor write. At that time, Europe had only 2 universities, while the Moors had 17 great universities, located in Almeria, Córdoba, Granada, Jaén, Malaga, Seville, and Toledo. In the 10th and 11th centuries, public libraries in Europe were non-existent, while Moorish Spain could boast of more than 70, of which the one in Córdoba housed 600,000 manuscripts. Moorish Spain was finally conquered in 1492 by a merger of the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon under Los Reyes Católicos, which basically means the Catholic kings of Fernando and Isabella. Again, it is ironic that it was instruments like the astrolabe and the compass, which was brought from China, that helped European explorers on their voyages of so-called discovery. It was through Africa that the new knowledge of China, India, and Arabia reached Europe. However, a key development which ultimately fueled the spread of European imperialism was the introduction and development of gunpowder, which was invented in China as a strategically destructive technology, though its route to Europe is unclear. Something came with the Mongol invasions. The birth of eugenics. In 1859, Charles Darwin wrote his seminal book on the origin of species, which many have misunderstood as implying the survival of the fittest, which may apply in a fixed environment as opposed to survival of the most adaptable, which is what happens in a changing environment such as this universe we inhabit. Some 24 years later, his cousin Sir Francis Galton introduced the Greek-derived word eugenics in his book, Inquiries into Human Faculty and its Development, in which he considered the betterment of humankind through the propagation of the British elite at the expense of lower social classes. This idea took hold in America, where the state of Connecticut in 1896 outlawed marriage by epileptics or, quote, feeble-minded, unquote, people. In 1903, the American Breeders Association was created to study eugenics. John Harvey Kellogg of Kellogg cereal fame organized the Race Betterment Foundation in 1911 and established a pedigree registry. The foundation hosted national conferences on eugenics in 1914, 1915, and 1928. From 1909 to 1979, California conducted some 20,000 sterilizations of mental patients whom they considered unfit to have children. This pseudoscience augmented the doctrine of white supremacy, which originated from polygenist Francois Bernier with a 1684 article entitled New Divisions of the Earth by the Different Species or Races of Man that Inhabit It. And this doctrine has become such a toxic force and ideology in today's world, especially for people of African descent. However, beyond targeting Africans, a small but powerful group of people across both sides of the Atlantic, including Carnegie, the Rockefellers, the Gates family, Winston Churchill, John Maynard Keynes, Bernard Shaw, and many other literati, promoted a more broad-based eugenics agenda, which was most notoriously trialed by Hitler in World War II. Lately, a covert successor group seemed to have decided on a much more drastic requirement for population control. This is global population control, in which suggests that the optimum planetary population is about 500 million souls. This fact was expressed in the Georgia Guidestones, a monument embodying a calendar, clock, and compass erected in 1980 in Elbert County in Georgia, USA, self-described as Guidestones to an Age of Reason. Given that the 1980 global population was around 5 billion souls, this implies a human cull of some 95% of humanity and should serve notice to indicate the scale and ruthlessness of those behind today's threats. Doubtless, they consider themselves to be on a God-ordained mission, but others have described them as sociopaths and psychopaths. Now we look at what I'm calling the death of the West, which is happening by slow degrees. With the advent of social media has come widespread dissemination, fanned by some politicians, of replacement theory, being the idea that there is a Jewish-originated conspiracy to replace local dominant white people with Jews or other immigrants, whether Black, Hispanic, Arab, or whichever other identity happens to be the most convenient in the local context. In truth, there is cause for their concern, but not for the socio-political reasons identified. A 1992 survey reported a 50% decline in sperm counts in men over the previous 50 years. 50% decline in 50 years. A systematic review in 2017 confirmed the trend, showing a 50 to 60% decline in North America, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand in the 38 years between 1973 and 2011. In women, miscarriages have been rising steadily, as has erectile dysfunction in men. Empirical evidence suggests these trends are affecting mainly Eurogenic populations, i.e. populations that originally came from European countries. As third world countries, populations continue to rise steadily. The declining fertility and birth rates in the West, which cumulatively average about 1% per annum, have been well documented, such that many first world so-called populations are experiencing irreversible declines below the accepted fertility rate, point of no return, of 1.7 children per woman. The highest fertility rate in Europe today belongs to France at 1.9 children per woman. This rate, however, is still below the population replacement level generally accepted of 2.1 births per woman. Simple linear projection suggests negligible fertility in Eurogenic populations within the next 50 years. And therefore, absent large-scale immigration or conquest, these populations will become increasingly senescent and dysfunctional. If you're not having any more babies or very few babies, the population that is going to be around to support the older retired population is going to be negligible, and there will be social problems. The lowest 15 fertility rates as of 2019 globally are South Korea, 0.9. 0.9. South Korea is a country in big trouble. Puerto Rico, in a US territory, Hong Kong, China's special administrative region, Malta, Singapore, each have a population replacement rate of 1.1. Macau, also China, Ukraine, Spain are at 1.2. Bosnia and Herzegovina, San Marino, Moldova, Italy, Andorra, Cyprus, Luxembourg are at 1.3. These are the lowest 15 fertility rates globally. This contrasts with the top 10 fertility rates, all in sub-Saharan Africa, which range from 5.1 in Burkina Faso to 6.8 in Niger in 2019, with a collective average of 4.6. So Africa is in no danger of suffering population decline from lack of fertility. The causes for first world population decline are not fully understood, but are thought to derive from exogenic, that is environmental factors like lifestyle and chemicals, which is basically diet and exposure to toxins. In particular, certain chemicals largely associated with plastics are known to have endocrine impacts. These endocrine disrupting chemicals, known as EDCs, they disrupt hormones, including the sex hormones needed for reproductive function. While some of these EDCs degrade over time, some, including some in pesticides and so on, are highly persistent and remain in food chains and soil once introduced. The lessons for Africa regarding the dangers of environmental degradation are nonetheless very clear. Now let's look at the story of banking. Common era banking can be traced back to 48 BC, when Julius Caesar arrogated to his administration the practice of the private money changers to issue their own currency. And instead, his administration minted state money for the good of all. The general prosperity which followed and Caesar's ensuing popularity were emphatically not appreciated by the money changers, and he was promptly assassinated for his intervention. This is a pattern that has continued throughout the ages. Some 78 years later, Jesus the Christ also took on the money changers for desecrating the temple, and he was also assassinated for his intervention. Thus, the conflict between financiers and sovereign states and meddlers has been simmering for over 2 millennia and is only now coming to a head on a global scale. A millennium later, in the 11th century, money changers and lenders had started the practice of issuing paper receipts and promissory notes for gold, silver, and other precious mineral deposits. And I realized that this system allowed them to lend more money than the amounts of deposits they held. Thus began the practice of fractional reserve banking and the extraordinary leverage these financiers had over governments, revolutionaries and rebels, business entrepreneurs, and general economic conditions. This is one of the greatest frauds that has been perpetrated on humanity and continues to be perpetrated today. By manipulating the money supply to wealth creation with easy money secured on property, they then repossess vulnerable properties when they tighten the money supply so that many companies go bankrupt in a continuous cycle of boom and bust. And this has continued to date. In 1100, King Henry I of England also took on the financiers and introduced something called the tally stick, which was the first device with anti-counterfeiting security features built in, and was thus one of the most successful and longest lasting currencies in history, assured by the need to pay taxes using tally sticks. The tally stick lasted for 726 years. To accommodate municipal authority, Dutch money changers established the first public stroke central bank in 1609 under the auspices of the city of Amsterdam. Sweden, though, was the first country to establish a central bank in 1668, a model which was rapidly followed by other European countries, including England, in 1694, when government officials, desperate for coin to prosecute their political objectives, agreed a charter for private financiers to establish the officially sanctioned but deceptively named Bank of England. It was not a national institution, it was a private institution. As one of the directors, William Patterson, stated, the bank hath benefit of interest on all monies which it creates out of nothing, unquote. Furthermore, the Bank of England would loan government officials as much of the new currency as they wanted, as long as they secured the debt by direct taxation of the British people. The Bank of England amounted to nothing less than the legal counterfeiting of a national currency for private gain. And thus, any country that would fall under the control of a private bank would amount to nothing more than a plutocracy. Their continuous expansion of the money supply led to inflation, from which they benefited tremendously. I think some of you may be recognizing the pattern of monetary management that exists today, where our currency continuously depreciates, and we call it monetary inflation and so on, and it continues to impoverish us as Ghanaians, as Africans, and so on. The Bank of England quickly attacked all rival currencies, especially in the colonies, of which the Americans were especially prosperous, and the subsequent prohibition on colonies of minting their own currency and imposition of tax in bullion led directly to the American Revolution in 1776. Control of the US's money supply would change hands 8 times. Over in 1760 Germany, Mayer Amschel Bauer, son of goldsmith and moneylender Moses Amschel Bauer, changed his name to Mayer Amschel Rothschild after the red shield that was part of their family emblem. And he set up the banking house of Rothschild, learning very quickly that if he loaned out money to government and royalty, it was far more profitable than loaning to individuals. This is because the loans made are bigger and backed by their nation's taxes. So he trained his 5 sons in the art of money creation. By dint of expedited information delivery after Napoleon's loss at Waterloo, Mayer Amschel Rothschild gained control of the Bank of England. Now, even though the Bank of England was nationalized in 1946, it remains under private control, since the government of the day had no cash to buy the shares, so instead issued government stocks on which they now have to pay interest. Sir Josiah Stamp, the director of the Bank of England during the years 1928 to 1941, made the following statement with regard to banking. Quote, the modern banking system manufactures money out of nothing. The process is perhaps the most astounding piece of sleight of hand that was ever invented. Banking was conceived in iniquity and born in sin. Bankers own the earth. Take it away from them, but leave them the power to create money. And with a flick of the pen, they will create enough money to buy it back again. Take this great power away from them, and all great fortunes like mine will disappear. And they ought to disappear, for then this would be a better and happier world to live in. But if you want to continue to be slaves of their banks and pay the cost of your own slavery, then let bankers continue to create money and control credit. Unquote. Just remind you, this is a quotation from a director of the Bank of England in 1941. Now we move to the creature from Jackal Island, which was the title of a book that was written to describe what follows next. In November 1910, 6 men met at the Jackal Island Club off the coast of Georgia to write a plan to reform America's banking system. 3 years later, the Federal Reserve Act was passed, granting a monopoly to a private cartel to print the US dollar and manage their monetary system. Let me emphasize again, the US Federal Reserve was created to grant a monopoly to a private cartel. It is not a federal government institution. It is a private institution that has a monopoly to print dollars. This cartel was controlled by the Rothschilds, who also control the German, French, and British central banks. Along with the key Bretton Woods institutions, World Bank and IMF, and the Bank for International Settlements, this group has been well placed to prosecute its agenda of subversion and ultimately state capture of the nations of the world. This is the threat we face today, ladies and gentlemen. It is instructive that no fewer than 8 presidents of the United States of America have stated publicly that their country is actually controlled by undemocratic, unaccountable, hidden forces that seek not the public good, but the exercise of power. With the US dollar as the global reserve currency currently, and the ability to print as much of it as they want, they have been able to influence and control people and events to an unprecedented degree. That the ultimate goal is complete global control is not in doubt. It has been articulated many, many times by high-level personnel, including US presidents and British prime ministers, and is generally referred to as the New World Order. Indeed, it has been advertised in plain sight since 1935 on every dollar bill issued by the US Federal Reserve System, which carry under the truncated pyramid on the obverse the Latin inscription Ordo Novus Seclorum, which is, as you might have guessed, stands for New World Order. Those of you with dollar bills might want to have a look at the back and read what is under that truncated pyramid. So now we move to section 2, convergence. To achieve this goal of global domination and control has, however, required certain capabilities which have only now become scalable to the degrees required. These are enumeration of unique asset entities and identification, surveillance and tracking of the same, control over individual autonomy, control over population numbers, disruption or arrestation of evolutionary development, control over education, social constructs and narratives, and control over livelihoods and economic development and power. Incidentally, some of you may have heard of NSSM 200, National Security Study Memorandum 200, which was written by Henry Kissinger many, many months ago, and which remains today a key part of US foreign policy. And that memorandum recognized that the US needed for its own interest, in its own interest, to control the population of other countries, which largely or mainly had assets that were considered strategic to the US. So here in Africa, we have assets that the US is interested in, but they are not interested in Africans. It is our assets that they want, and therefore, if they can get rid of us, the better for them. So technological advances such as the internet, cellular telephony, satellite tracking, social media, cheap IP cameras, genetically modified organisms and foods, and nanotechnologies, including nanobots and implantable sensors, artificial intelligence and big data mining, as well as blockchain systems, have now made it possible to achieve all of the above, in many cases covertly or surreptitiously through their mainstream media management. With control of the international UN organizations, WHO in particular, FAO, UNICEF, etc., the globalist agenda has been advanced very far, with most governments and economies under the sway of various international institutions. Prior to 9/11, for example, there were a small number of jurisdictions that resisted BIS control, as Bank for International Settlements. These were subsequently targeted as potential terrorist havens and supporters, and they were disarmed, disabled, destroyed, or otherwise neutralized as a threat to the intended hegemony. After the conveniently timed Arab Spring, there are now thought to be only 3 countries in the world still resistant to globalist control: Syria, Iran, and North Korea, each of which, as you know, is experiencing severe sanctions and regime change pressures. A particularly apposite example of the global reach of international banksters, as some call them, is how they covertly change the long-standing WHO definition of pandemic and the definition of vaccine to allow for the expedited deployment of non-safety tested experimental mRNA treatments as the only acceptable global health priority response. These treatments are now generating alarmingly negative health outcomes to many, including what is being termed as vaccine-induced AIDS or AIDS. As a depopulation control, COVID-19 has served as a very useful proof of concept for a bioweapon. Its one drawback is its low lethality rate. However, if you listen closely to pronouncements from Messrs. Fauci and Gates, they suggest they might be working on much more lethal pathogens such as cowpox and monkeypox, which are much more deadly fatality rates of around 30%. This pandemic also was a powerful demonstration of the ideology of fear, which has become so pervasive in political and other spheres of life. Probably not many realize it is a tool and an expression of the Antichrist, given that fear is the antithesis of love as demonstrated by the Christ. The power of mainstream media mismanagement has led to what has been termed mass formation psychosis, being a situation where individuals are decoupled from each other while being filled with anxiety or fear and therefore more susceptible to authoritarian control. I could go on, but let me skip. We've also witnessed how on our continent, liberal forces are sought to hijack educational curricula with the LGBTQI agenda in an attempt to decouple educational indoctrination from accepted cultural and societal norms. Underlying this is the attempt to destroy the concept of family as a basic structural unit of society, offering stability and continuity as custodian of core social values. Its destruction will create an instructional vacuum in which the state will increasingly impose dysfunctional values and practices. This is already happening in the US, as we've seen. It is important to understand that much of significance that happens in our world today is not mere happenstance, but is carefully orchestrated in a process known as the Hegelian dialectic, which involves 3 steps: thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. 1, you create a problem. 2, you manage the public response to the problem. And then 3, you offer a predetermined solution to the supposed problem. This was used by the globalists to establish their first attempt at world governance, which led to the League of Nations after World War I. When that fell apart, World War II was used to introduce the United Nations that we have today. Today, as the world edges closer to WW3 with the Russian-Ukraine crisis, simmering tension in the Middle East, rising tensions in the Far East, and increasingly assertive China and growing global economic vulnerabilities, we have to wonder what next. So in a nutshell, this is the goal that has been referred to as a New World Order or NWO, though chances are few have given thought to what that might entail. Allied to that, as a precursor, are August deliberations of the World Economic Forum or WEO, supported by less public programs like the Bilderberg meetings and others. So the cross strands are enumerated below. Current challenges. New World Order has 3 core components: one world government, one world currency, one world religion. And one world government is being driven by threats of war or actual wars, pandemics, climate change, and so on. They are creating global problems so that they can justify a global government to address these global challenges. The one world currency was advertised as far back as Economist January 1988. We are looking at 34 years ago, where they spoke of the need for one world currency and a digital currency which would afford them control, surveillance, ID, and so on. And the third strand of that is one world religion. And this is important to address the issue of human evolution and the workings of the spirit, where people have the ability to essentially throw off a lot of these constrictions that are being placed on them. Did we but realize that we were imbued with freedom of choice, and there's this transhumanism agenda that is going on, which is basically trying to dampen the spirituality of people so that they accept the materialism of the New World Order. And in the eschatology of Christianity, there's talk of the Antichrist and so on coming with a false religion. Within Islam, there's also the talk of the Mahdi coming to unify the world under Islam. And then you have the globalists who are using the Christian church also to control many so-called Christian nations. So the drive of the Rockefellers and their allies to create a one world government, combining supercapitalism and communism under the same tent, all under their control, was referenced by Congressman Larry P. McDonald in 1976. Apart from the NWO, they are also using the World Economic Forum to promote the idea of the Great Reset. That involves economic deterioration, which we are seeing, but somehow it's the masses that suffer, and the wealth and power of the transnationals is increased. And in fact, it was recently estimated that 62 people own more than the rest of the world combined. 62 people. The debt burden on many countries is leading to societal collapse. We've seen the rioting and so on in Sri Lanka, which is reminiscent of South America in the 80s. The collapse of the petrodollar and the USA, as well as European prosperity, seems to be imminent, given what is happening with fuel supplies, with the emergence of petrol or the gas ruble, and China also floating a digital yuan and so on. How does this impact Africa? Well, some of you may have seen a video by Howard Nicholas, who's, as a globalist, has the zero-sum game mentality that for somebody to benefit, somebody else has to lose. And this video made a very strong case for why Africa must remain poor so that Europe and others can be prosperous. And this is one of the contributing factors to all the tensions and the dysfunctions we have on our continent, where there are insurgencies and never-ending civil wars and so on. Most of these are funded from abroad. Okay, so counterpoints. Last section. What are our options in all of this? I think we have 5 core challenges ahead of us to address in a sustainable program of action and development. 1, clarity of vision. What are we trying to achieve? We need to answer that question. 2, food security. 3, unified governance. 4, economic sufficiency and resilience. And 5, educational reform. So I'll expand on these very quickly. Clarity of vision. I'm reminded of John Lennon's story, where his teacher sent the class an exercise, and that exercise was for them to write down what they would like to become when they grew up. And so they set to work, and after a while, the teacher asked them to read out their replies. And many came up with answers like doctor, politician, train driver, entrepreneur, and so on. John Lennon wrote one word: happy. And the teacher said, John, I don't think you understood the question. John said to the teacher, no, miss, I don't think you understand life. Today's world generally uses GDP as a measure of progress, sometimes along with various human or social developmental indices. This has a very significant disadvantage of encouraging unlimited economic growth as a measure of success. On a finite planet, that is clearly unsustainable and requires a rethink. And in that rethink, I think it may be worthwhile to have a look at Bhutan, which, apart from GDP, uses as its most important economic index of development the gross national happiness, in which they seek to establish what it is that makes people happy, secure, and therefore productive, and so on. And they do this largely through surveys. Incidentally, China, which few think of as a democratic country, also seek public input into their policies by conducting periodic surveys. Our AU Agenda 2063 simply doesn't go far enough. But then if you look at the AU's constitutive instruments, formulated it as a facilitator for African governments, a bit like a glorified secretariat, rather than a conscious effort to bring about a unified Africa under one government. So it is that after 20 years of existence, there is not even a committee that has been set up to think about how to draft a constitution for a united Africa. And we are extremely vulnerable as a result. Item 2, food security. There are several things we can do here. It's important, I think, that we promote the organic farming and eliminate the use of pesticides and artificial fertilizers, which, as I mentioned earlier, get into the food chain, into our soil and so on, and have deleterious and negative impacts on our fertility. We have many traditional African methods that ensure sustainability, both of crops in the environment and the soil and so on. And we need to look at those. Technologies like hydroponics can be used also. We have technology today to condense water from the air, and that can be used to top up hydroponics installations, even in arid regions where there may not be too much water. An exemplary initiative I must mention here is the Songhai movement by Nigerian scientist Father Godfrey Nzamujo, which combines plant production, animal production, and fish farming as key links in a primary production system. All of these things, all of these sectors actually energize one another. It takes the output or effluent from one and feeds it into the other as food, and vice versa. And so it's an ecologically robust and natural cycle that provides variety, provides resilience, provides sustainability. Thirdly, unified governance. We need to look at a political administration that is dedicated to African progress only. We need to consider dissolving our national colonial boundaries, and we need to bring in the diaspora for their energy, their resources, their vision, their understanding of the world outside Africa's shores. We need to consider abolishing the divisive multi-party system, which was brought in and encouraged by the First World in order to divert our attention from the challenges we face, and instead we spend our time and resources fighting each other for supremacy within the party system. It's completely nonsensical. There are other forms of democracy than the competitive democracy that we have, and we need to look at how we can bring about more consultative and more complementary systems of government. In this, we have models that we can draw on. Many of our native architectural systems are actually fractal in nature. Fractals are natural technology where structures self-replicate at many different levels. And a fractal structure where you've got communities actually electing or choosing a representative, which then goes on to a bigger catchment area like a district or a region and so on, and all the way up to an African Congress, I think would be good. This would be based on meritocracy, much like Singapore, and also much like China. China has, it's a one-party state, yes, but like I said earlier, they do involve the populace, and they ensure that at the various levels of the Chinese party, you don't progress from one to the next until you have demonstrated administrative competence in your particular realm. So the people who go to the top are the very best of the very best. We also need to look at physical military security. Why is it Africa has no unified Africa command? We've got the French here, we've got the Americans here, we've got the Brits, we've got the Russians. They have Africa commands, we don't. How does that make sense? And because of that, we are fragmented, we are unable to contain the incursions, other destabilization efforts that are brought in by external agencies. We need to look at biodiversity and biosecurity and restore respect for the natural created environment, which our forefathers did with various cultural practices. I was silent when the Catholic priest made an impassioned plea that humanity should recognize nature as the first face of God. We cannot call ourselves religious, Christians, Muslims, whatever it is, and desecrate the face of God that we have been brought to live on as stewards and custodians. We also then need to ensure that we have the personnel and facilities to be able to track biodiversity and biosecurity. We need robust health systems. We should view the COVID experience as a serious wake-up call to the fact that of our unpreparedness on so many levels: intelligence, genetics, diagnostics, high-tech pharmaceuticals production, supply and distribution chains, contact tracing, epidemiological testing and management. And we need to consider other systems like bioresonance diagnostics and therapies, and research expand our traditional healing systems. Finally, under governance, we need also to make provision for social security, providing a safety net for those who, for one reason or another, are unable to make their way economically. In the past, we had communalism, which we express in some areas as Ubuntu, and we also have the extended family system, which has been under attack for some time. Fourthly, economic sufficiency and resilience. I think we need to consider circular economics, much as the Songhai experiment demonstrated is possible. We need to take ownership of Africa's resources and stop seeking rent payments from others who come into Africa to cart away the value of our resources. If necessary, we should be able to collateralize these resources in situ to raise capital for development. The late President Magufuli managed to execute a number of high visibility, high value projects without having to borrow money from anybody. We need also then to endeavor to utilize our resources and minimize waste and pollution. And this will go under reduce, reuse, recycle, repair, recover, repurpose, and if necessary, rot in order to transform. We need to look at our energy security. Africa's resource rich, but energy poor. We have oil, we have hydro, we have sunlight. We also need to consider new paradigms. There's a saying in Akan that where you find a challenge, where you find an illness, there also you will find the cure. And I believe that the good Lord did not put us, creation did not put us on this planet without making provision for the energy that we need, without spoiling our environment. And over the years, many inventors have come up with what some call zero-point energy or so-called free energy systems. The most recent being a Zimbabwean, Chika Mba, who invented some very remarkable devices. Predictably, he was not given the support and the recognition that he should have had in Africa. He was offered some support in the US, and well, the latest communication I had about him was that he was fighting for his life, having been poisoned. Yeah, many inventors of free energy systems have come to a sticky end or disappeared, and so on. But these things are possible. And if one looks at the Maxwell equations and you look at how they have been derived and are taught in schools, you realize that they are being mistaught. There is a gap between what they say and what we actually use. So that bears looking into. We need also to look at our communications and cybersecurity. Why we don't have our own satellite network on Africa so we can talk more easily to our neighbors, I don't know. On that front also, we need to develop an ethical hacker core to address the matters of cybersecurity. Technological advancements. Now, this is where we have adopted this practice of waiting for the West to make technologies, and then we buy from them and so on and so forth. When there are indigenous technologies that we really should have been developing, especially in the fields of computing and divination and so on. I speak of Owari, which many know as a game, but which Professor Aquino demonstrated could be used as a digital computer. Then there's IFA divination system, which turns out to actually embody elements of quantum computing. On our own planets, on our own continent, we have the pyramids, which were set up as a calendar, as a clock, compass, chronometer, and a calibration of planetary dimensions and parameters. One story I might share with you. There's a tribe in East Africa. It's a nomadic tribe, and they wander the face of the earth. From time to time, they meet together at one particular spot where they choose, the elders will choose a strong young man who will strike a particular hollow rock, which gives out infrasound. And then they spend the next 3 days celebrating this event. And they will disperse until the next time they meet, 66 years, 3 months, and 4 days later. We are looking here, ladies and gentlemen, at the celebration of a heartbeat, which probably is not even existent in our galaxy. 66 years, 3 months, and 4 days. But we have people who are sensitive to this and are able to basically capture the vibrations of this particular entity here on Earth. There will be those also who know of the Dogon, who were aware that at the heart of the Sirius constellation is a trinary system, but you need to be indoctrinated into their secret societies before you can understand what there is here. More locally, John Collins, a musicologist at Legon, wrote a book not so long ago called Roots, Rhythms, Relativity, in which he showed that many of our rhythms, dances, and so on have parallels with quantum theory and with relativity. So our culture is deep, and we have simply failed to understand it, to research it, to develop it, to provide with us the technology solutions that we need for our continent. And finally, I'd like to touch on educational reform. We need to own our history and narratives. The early bit that I shared with you about the Moors in Europe, taking civilization to Europe, you will not find in many history curricula, and certainly not in the West. And because of this, we have the temerity to look down on us as having contributed nothing to global society when their civilization came from our contributions. We also need to understand the human potential and possibility. That one, we are spirits having an incarnate experience, not bodies. And the worldview that this will promote, I believe, will be very explosive in terms of our human relations and in terms of what we are able to do. We also need to understand the laws of the universe and look at our traditional and ancient belief systems and practices, such as animism, the idea that spirit pervades everything. And finally, I'd just like to share with you one thing. Most people are aware of our Jinyame symbol. I don't think many people are aware that that Jinyame symbol is a multi-level artifact that describes the structure of our galaxy. It describes the structure of our planet. the fact that there's a magnetic north which is inclined to the axis of rotation, the fact that there is a rotation, the fact that there are two, what do you call them? After the name escapes me, something of Capricorn and Cancer, the tropics of Capricorn and Cancer. All of these are embodied in that one symbol, dynamic. And it just gives an indication of the depth of understanding that our forefathers had before white man came along to tell us that we knew nothing. Thank you all for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Max. This is actually a tour de force. I'm sure you could go on and on. It's incredible the ground you have covered, the engagement with so many disciplines, all in just one talk. It's just very fascinating. And I'm sure that our listeners will have a lot of questions and comments. Just in terms of your engagement with history alone of this crisis. I mean, there's so much. So I will not attempt to summarize. And by the way, while you were speaking, the event chair joined Dr. Pius Siakwah, who is a research fellow here at the Institute of African Studies. Maybe Pius, you want to start and maybe take take questions and comments from our patrons, and then I can come back to draw the curtains. Or what is your suggestion?
Is his microphone on or is it muted?
Pius? Okay. I think I'm not sure whether
his microphone is muted, I think.
Yeah, so it's fine. We would like to welcome questions and comments. You can raise your virtual hand, and then when I see you, I will ask you to speak. Please raise your virtual hand, and then
Chika, I think Mr. Ben Ahunu.
Yes, Ben Ahunu, can you please unmute and speak? Can it be a question or a comment? We'll take a couple of them before we return to Max.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Max, thanks for the lecture. I caught a phrase, if I'm correct, or if I'm wrong, correct me, that you said we should dissolve our current political boundaries. Was that right? Then I go on. If it is so, then I'll go on.
Yes, I did suggest that.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, where would we be reverting to our tribal or ethnic boundaries, or what? What will Ghana look like after when such a Ghanaian boundary is dissolved? I'm just wondering, these days with so much urbanization and people moving around, where would you, for instance, say the Ashantis would be, the Gans would be, whatnot? You see, if you have a Gan living in Wa, an Ashanti man living in Keta, that kind of thing. Well, are we now going to go back to our ethnic enclaves or what? I don't understand.
No.
Yes.
I'm talking about establishing administrative units. I'm not suggesting people should return to their points of origin or migrate or anything like that at all. These are administrative units. You know, today we have districts and district assemblies and so on. It doesn't matter who lives in the district, but if you live there, then live in that district. So what I'm saying is that there are, proposals have come from the diaspora, for example, the region 6 of the AU, where one person is proposing splitting Africa up into 10,000 administrative units. Okay, so we can go with many levels, or we can go with few levels, but many districts and so on. The fractal approach is one where you try to manage, you have manageable numbers at every level. So I don't know if that answers your question. I'm not suggesting that
Yes, I understand. But for instance, if you take, for instance, Ghana and Ivory Coast, or Cote d'Ivoire, or Ghana and Togo, yes, you have a man living in Keita, and the wife is in what's the other one? Lome, right?
Yes.
I was at Magnori, and the man was riding a bike across the Volta, the White Volta there. It was dry, actually. The river was underground, but he was right. And so we asked him where he was going. He said he was going to his farm. He said, but you a Ghanaian? He said, whether Ghanaian or not, his farm was there before the white man came and demarcated that that part is Burkina Faso and this part is Ghana. So now, but you see, the district assembly in that area does not extend to whatever the Burkinabes call theirs. Let's say they also call theirs the district assembly. It doesn't extend, and yet there is the same people who are just living across on both sides.
Indeed. So you're making my case that dividing people artificially by colonial boundaries really does, we do ourselves a disservice. And we should recognize where there are communities that naturally gel together and allow them to take local ownership of their local development. That's all I'm saying. Yeah, let people return power to the people on the ground so that they can decide for themselves at their own local level how they would like their administrative structures to look. And so you have a number of these local administrative structures who can form, you can have a rule that if you have a population of more than so much, then you need to get together and set up an electoral college to elect one representative from that electoral college to go to the next level. Okay, these are just ideas, which will probably require quite a bit of work and interrogation in order to come up with a workable system. But I'm basing this system on structures that we have historically used ourselves, which are based on natural patterns. And I think if we emulate nature, we are not likely to go very far. I hope that answers your question.
Well, somebody else may have a concern, but not quite, but I'll take it for now.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Ben and Max. Do we have another question, comment? Okay. Pius is finally here. Pius, or somebody else was speaking before that? Okay, Pius, you can go.
Yeah, Max, thank you very much for the grand ideas. Mm-hmm. But my first question is, where would this change start from? Where the political elites, that may be those who control the resource, the government, you are asking them to change the system that they are beneficiary of.
Yeah.
So is it from the AU or where? ECOWAS or where?
Well, it can be from multiple points. Yeah, there's, I forget who coined the saying, but somebody made observation that we should never discount the power of a small group of people to change the world. And that indeed, changing the world has only ever come from a small group of people who have an idea which they prosecute, and if its time has come, it gathers critical momentum and suddenly people start to get on board. But we have the AFCFTA, for example, which was, as my understanding goes, largely pioneered by the AU. Okay, and they found a responsive audience in the members of the AU, being African heads of state. And because they could see the benefits to it. Beyond the top level, that top level intervention, we have many people on the ground who are also quietly trying to revolutionize their lives, their neighborhoods, their districts, and so on and so forth, by doing things which demonstrate the capability to be self-reliant and to develop their local area. And one of the things that we are very good at in Ghana is we like to copy things. Somebody sets up a hairdressing shop in one neighborhood. Suddenly you've got 10 hairdressing shops in the same neighborhood. So hopefully, if as private individuals, as cooperatives, for example, we do something that works, then hopefully others will start to emulate what we're doing, and gradually ripples will spread. The Songhai system that I mentioned earlier, the proprietor has trained, I think, is it 10,000 or 20,000 people who have come to see what he's doing. They've heard of it, they like what they've seen, and they've gone back to replicate that system in their hometowns in the West. So there's that organic progression that is also a possibility, that you and I, from wherever we are, can start to work towards making changes happen and suggesting changes to other people. Have you considered this? Have you thought about doing that?
Cool. I don't know whether there's someone else who wants to make a comment. Or Pius, you have a follow-up question?
Yes, please.
Ben.
Yes. Mike, Max.
Yes, sir.
Why do you think that just in recent times, when Ethiopia was on the verge of being overrun by the Tigrayans, and I think, if I'm not wrong, the Africans see Ethiopia as the capital, the headquarters of the AU. Or did you hear of any African country, at least I didn't hear, rallying to the support of Ethiopia? They saw it as, the African countries saw it as an internal kind of war, because after all, the Tigrayans were part of Ethiopia, and so you should fight your war.
Yes.
What do you think about that?
I think it is very short-sighted. Our leaders like Kwame Nkrumah and so on had a Pan-Africanist vision, and he helped a number of emergent or nascently independent countries to fight against external aggression. Now, I suppose part of the unwritten, or maybe this rules of the AU is that it's a gentleman's club. So everybody stays in their lane, as they say. And I think that is the wrong mindset. I think we need to take ownership and responsibility in our neighborhood, however we define that neighborhood. Now, very often when you over access to and control of resources, and therefore generally underlying them is a sense of injustice. And Ghana's motto is freedom and justice. We were founded to prosecute those two values in our country and on our continent. And this is something, therefore, we should seek to promote, that there has to be justice. You can't take their resources without acknowledging that they have stewardship over it, without making any recompense and so on. That's just plain theft. And unfortunately, it happens a lot. But we do need, if we are to prevent this kind of thing, to strengthen the AU, to reform the AU, and to make it more unifying body than just a gentleman's club, where heads of state go to drink champagne and talk. How that is, I don't know. The floor is open. I am but one. There are many of you. So.
Yes. Thank you so much, Max. I can't see any other hand up, but if somebody does decide to say something, the person can indicate. But you know, one thing I enjoyed a lot about your presentation, Max, is something that very frequently doesn't happen. This a good part of your presentation was about trying to grapple with the most difficult problems and trying to offer solutions, the way Africa can contend with this global behemoth that you so eloquently articulated, both its origins and how it has continued to have impact all over the world and the changing dynamics. So what I'm wondering, two things at the individual level, because even from where you sit, you can see that we are all, so to say, what we can say, what we can do, the contributions we can make, the change we can bring about as Africans, you know, that are circumscribed by such things as colonialism, neocolonialism. In fact, the crisis that I speak about, that is all encompassing. So at the individual level, what can a person do? What can an ordinary academic like myself do? You know, what can the market woman do? What can the artisans there in the streets do to contribute to this? Because sometimes it's as if the government doesn't do it, then nothing else. And the government have all these other vested interests. In fact, to a certain extent, the government, African government, are post-colonial government. By that, it implies that they learned their craft from the colonialists. So they see their territories as conquered territories, ultimately. So asking them, and that's, I think I'm picking back to Pius' earlier question, asking them to make some of these changes is like asking ultimately Europe to make the changes. But at the individual level, what are the contributions? And then you spoke about educational reforms.
Yes.
I don't know whether you meant educational reforms, or you're thinking in terms of transformation, or you're thinking in terms of change. You're thinking in terms of, are you thinking in terms of the curriculum, you know, is it pedagogy? Is it the entire educational policy, like Nkrumah himself valiantly pursued? So what are those reforms that you think? I mean, I'm really kind of interested in those kinds of solutions to the crisis, the global crisis you have put Africans so precariously in the midst. So what kind of educational reforms or educational transformations and in which particular directions are you looking?
Okay, those are very big questions, and I'm not sure I have all the answers. What I'm thinking of when I talk about educational reform is actually more personal transformation. You made a point, leaders mainly being by the West, and therefore they have mentality, and they very often do not recognition to indigenous knowledge, systems, and practices, and so on. And so we've inherited educational structures and systems that are not fit for purpose. They were originally set up moderately educated people who were able to literate and enumerate and so on, to staff the civil service and to act as a buffer between the rulers, the colonial rulers, and the rest of the populace. So they weren't expected to do very much more than that. And our educational systems have continued that tradition with a Eurocentric curriculum, where we are grooming people to be able to write essays and describe scientific experiments rather than actually being able to do those scientific experiments and being able to explore our natural environment to learn what it offers. Yeah. So to that extent, we will always lag the West technology because they have got systems where they encourage people to interrogate the universe that they are living in. We don't do this. We also have this cultural inhibition where we have not taught our children to be inquisitive. Maybe because we don't want the authority challenge or whatever it is. So we discourage children from asking difficult questions, you know, and this naturally will create a society where people do not interrogate their world as to what can I do with this, what can I do with that, and so on. So we inhibit ourselves by some of our cultural practices. We inhibit ourselves by our unwanted deference to authority also. And maybe it's because of that when we bring up our children with a kind of inferiority complex, you know, and we don't consider these things, but it happens. When you send a child and use words like, hey, small, one do this, one do that, and so on and so forth, they grow up thinking that, well, maybe they're not worth very much. And so if they should happen to come into positions of power and so on, they get, I mean, the egos get bloated and they begin to act in very dysfunctional ways. So we need to look at the way we bring up our children. We need to look at how we teach, what we teach, and we also need to look at what we do teach. Yeah, so it's a whole gamut. And, you know, I mentioned some of the achievements of our forefathers and the technologies that we have that we don't even recognize, like digital computing and quantum computing systems and so on. IBM has spent I don't know how many billions of dollars trying to create a quantum computer. And yet there's somebody sitting in Benin who can give you a quantum computing outcome if you give him a question. And all he needs is a few sticks and a few stones and whatever it is. But he can create that indeterminacy of outcome that goes with quantum computing, and therefore also cryptography and so on and so forth. These are things we should be looking to formalize and transmit to our children so that we can come up with world-beating technologies that nobody else has got.
I think those are great replies. If there are no further questions and comments, then we'll allow just a few minutes, a couple of minutes already, for people who want to say hi to the presenter or to ourselves, and then we can end the proceedings. If you want to say hi, you can unmute, and then after a minute, we can.
So, Mark, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, I can. Hello, Dennis.
So, thanks for the presentation, Max. And I was wondering as you were speaking whether or not we can think of ways to transform the creative work from the lab to the factory, you know, because those are excellent ideas that you've expounded on. Yes, but there always seems to be the question of how we can, you say weaponize, but how we could actually put the these discoveries and inventions into a factory, and then, or whether that's the system you want to create, a type of market system where you weaponize or we produce those things in a mass production and sell.
Yeah, I think this is where the diaspora can play a very significant role, where we can take a leaf out of China's book. China didn't industrialize overnight by its own self. They had a deliberate policy of sending Chinese students to go and study in the US and in Europe, and to work in the US and in Europe in the factories, so that they would get an understanding of how mass production works and so on in those factories. And Those students then went back to China to pass on the knowledge that they had gathered. That was a deliberate policy. There's nothing to stop us doing the same. Nothing to stop us. And if you look in our diaspora, we have so many Ghanaians in NASA, and other very high-level institutions in the US, doing fantastic work, but they're benefiting the US. They're not benefiting Africa. In part, also because African leaders and industrialists have not recognized that this talent is there, and it is there at our disposal if we should provide the infrastructure within which it can flourish. And I have classmates who have gone and studied medicine. They've got a lot of experience out in America and so on. And they've come back to Ghana to share their expertise with local Ghanaians and local clinics and hospitals and so on. And they have been frustrated because the system, for some reason, resents the fact that they have come with all this superior expertise and what have you. And they make life difficult for them. I mean, one such friend, after a classmate, came back after 18 months of not being paid by the national, Ghana Health Service. He left. He went back to his private practice where he was very comfortable. Thank you very much. And so we need to make a conscious determination that we have to build our expertise on this continent and bring back those who have got that expertise and groom them and support them to be able to make a significant difference in our societies. At the moment, we are not doing that. But then this is a conversation that is ongoing, and hopefully it will start to percolate through into the minds of the decision makers and policy makers. That this is something that we have to do. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Max. Comrade Jechitano, do you want to jump in one last time?
No, not particularly. I was reflecting on what Max was saying. Well, I mean, there's many dimensions which I think resonate with my own thinking, and also are directly relevant for the kinds of things that we see unfolding today: the cost of living crisis, the inflation, the way in which Africa is squeezed by its lack of effective, supply chains of its own, or its very marginal and dependent position in other people's supply chains and so on. I think it makes very important points. The only thing I would have liked to hear more of, which I just want to signal for future, exchange and discussion, both after the meeting and so on. The only thing I would have liked to hear is how to contend, because I mean, I thought Max was excellent when it came to recommendations about how to build our capacities and our entrepreneurial, our knowledge, our skills, our conduits, so to speak, our institutions and so on. I think it was very good there, but it didn't directly touch on how do we contend with the established powers that be in terms of their own strength. Because, so for example, I mean, we can take people to, like the Chinese did, they can take people abroad, they train and they come back. First of all, your state now has lost so much legitimacy that the capabilities and the capacity to command the loyalties and give people the assurance that if you go and you come back, you won't be treated like his colleague who went to the National Health Service in Ghana. That is missing. You do not have the political legitimacy or the social agenda where there's a sufficient enough buy-in. That's the first thing. But the second thing is that even if you were to succeed halfway, and I think there are other factors in, let's say, China's transformation that we can come to, probably as decisive, if probably not more decisive, which we can come to later on. But my point here is this: if today, for example, there's you take let's say a case, Rwanda is by no means my model country, not at all, not by any stretch of the imagination. But that doesn't mean that in every instance, every single government can get everything wrong. Rwanda partnered with Uganda, with Kenya, with Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania in the Trump era to do two things. One was to ban secondhand clothing, what we call broniwo in Ghana, okay, imported secondhand clothing. And the second was that in the same step, to begin to pool together cotton and textile supply chains from the agricultural raw material production side, to pull together industrial and manufacturing, textile and garment capacity, and to pull together marketing and so on and so forth. This was an agreement at the level of the EAC. The moment that the ban on second-hand clothing was about to be implemented, obviously the biggest exporter, unlike West Africa, the biggest exporter of second-hand clothing to East Africa is from the United States. And for all manner of reasons, including the potential ways in which the US trade representation, that's the US foreign trade institution, judged that this may affect the kind of AGOA, Africa Growth and Opportunity, all the kinds of things that allows US textile people to maintain control from Africa and so on and so forth. They decided that they will attack the African governments who were doing this. And all the 3 or 4 countries backed off, apart from Rwanda. Rwanda was the only one which went ahead with the ban. Of course, on its own, it couldn't follow through in terms of the supply chain issues, the trading issues, the manufacturing issues. So the first country for the United States under Trump to impose trade sanctions on was not China. It was actually Rwanda. Nobody really talks about that, but that's true. What I'm simply saying is that a tiny country like Rwanda, which has absolutely no footing, no foothold in the global garment manufacture, not even in basic cotton production, can attract this degree of direct sanctions. And Uganda and Rwanda is a favored child and friend and pet and ally of all these big powers everywhere. Look at where Britain is sending its refugees and so on and so forth. So basically, if you provoke economic interest, there is no limit to the response to deeply ruthless. So in other words, we can't simply develop by sidestepping, develop in parallel. You have to find ways in which you are confronting the powers that, and to do so doesn't mean at the level of interstate. Obviously, Rwanda cannot confront, the United States or whatever it is. But what does it mean at different levels of society? What those who, do you understand me? I mean, you can't develop a different model, you initiate or inaugurate or pursue to relatively successful conclusion, or at least at the point of breakthrough, a successful model of development without confronting the structures of neoliberal capitalism as they exist in Africa. Somehow you have to be able to roll them back in some measure. How do you do that without it? And those are elements which I thought can be important. I mean, you have to be in some measure an anti-neoliberal, openly so, to be able to buy yourself the room. How do we go about that? How do we build a political agency that can constitute the alliance for that, and so on and so forth? That was on my mind a bit. I know I'm coming in late, but
No,
thank you. Max, thank you very much. Excellent discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. Max, maybe just briefly, because we're out of time. 2 minutes response. Okay,
no problem. No, I'd like to thank Mr. China for his very accurate observations. And this underlines exactly the point I was making, that we do need a unified Africa. If a united Africa had told Trump that if you are going to try and pick on Rwanda, you will stop our shipments of cobalt or coltan or whatever it is, we would have backed down. But one stake on its own isn't very strong. You bond it together 50 other stakes, then you've got something that is worthwhile. And so the need for African unity has never been more acute. And I don't know what it's going to take, but somehow we need to signal this up to our leaders that the current status quo is inadequate. It leaves us extremely exposed. It's an existential threat to our world, and we need to do something about greater unification and acting in concert. The fractal model would work very well with this kind of thing.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Max. This has been so enlightening, deliberate, measured conversation, but with a lot of insights that we can take away. Once again, we are thanking you, Max, for the excellent presentation, and thanking those who were able to join us online. We'll come back next week with another very interesting conversation, this time on the topical issue of language. We'll have a research fellow here at the Institute of African Studies who will offer us what we expect to be a mouth-watering conversation. Thank you once again. And if you want to say hi, you have just 30 seconds this time before we can then end the meeting. You can unmute and say hi to anyone. By the way, Tai Adelaja left some interesting citations, texts out there in the chat box. So for those who might be interested, you can avail yourself of those recommended readings. But otherwise, thank you for joining us. I will be closing.
Thank you, Chika Mba.
Okay, thank you.